All right, the infrastructure priority list is, as you know, the tool or the system through which the team at Te Waihanga, the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, is seeking to progress the next step of transitioning from strategy to practicality and ensuring greater certainty for the infrastructure sector. Leading our next panel conversation is the Director of Economics for Te Waihanga, the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission. Please welcome Peter Nunns.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Infrastructure New Zealand for having us on today and for all of you to come out, for coming out to this panel. You might be wondering, what is an infrastructure priority list? So to start, I just wanted to offer a very sort of succinct high-level definition. What we're talking about here is a standardized process to assess infrastructure proposals at a few set points during the planning process. So, in plain English, this is stuff that hasn't been funded yet. We're trying to figure out what to do, whether it's a good idea. That will culminate in a list of vetted proposals that are available to decision makers and the public. Once again, plain English, this is to inform the decisions we're making and the public discussions we're having about the priorities for our country. This was a proposal that we floated out as a recommendation in Rotaki Hanana o Aotearoa, the New Zealand Infrastructure Strategy, which we released last year. And I want to talk a little bit about where that fits in with some of the other initiatives that we've got on the go and how that fits into our long-term view of a sustainable pipeline of infrastructure investment for New Zealand. What this graph shows is kind of, investment over time, what we can see over time. And through our national infrastructure pipeline, we can see the stuff that currently has a funding commitment, and we can see that out 3 to 5 years, because that's typically how much notice we get of what people are going to do. In the very, very long term, I'm talking 30 years out, we can do what's called an infrastructure needs assessment, and we did a version of this for the 2022 to 2052 strategy, saying, what are the things that we can see coming down the pipe with some certainty? Hospital renewals, climate change, adapting to that, population growth and demographic change. Things that will drive infrastructure investment in the long term, but which haven't yet turned into specific projects. The aim of the infrastructure priority list is to sit in the middle of those two things and offer us a venue to take some of those long-term needs that we can see coming and turn them into sort of planning and ultimately funding decisions that are visible to us on the way through. So that's the infrastructure priority list. We're in the process of developing this, and we'll be coming back out to many of you in coming months to work on some details for this. But I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the things that we're thinking about as we go about that task. Problems that we see in our current system that we'd like to address. And here we're drawing quite significantly upon the OECD's Governance of Infrastructure survey, which it periodically does. First thing I'd like to highlight about this, it's not all a bad news story. There's a lot of things that New Zealand does excellently by global standards, and we are highlighting the gaps and the challenges that we'd like to address. The first one of those is how we turn our long-term strategic vision into a set of projects and a set of priorities. Most OECD countries use priority lists of some form, whether they're cross-sectoral or sector-specific, to do this. New Zealand's in the minority of countries that doesn't at the moment. A second issue that we face is around independent and impartial appraisal of infrastructure proposals in planning. The OECD again identifies this as quite important to solve what you might call as poacher-gamekeeper problems in the development of projects. And it was good to see Infrastructure New Zealand put out a position piece on this the other week that highlighted that is something where we have a bit of a system gap at the moment. And the third challenge is how we guard value for money through our planning and project decision choices. Now, I'm an economist. I could lecture you about cost-benefit analysis. I don't want to do that because it's not necessarily the only way to test value for money. But what the OECD's data highlights is that we are out the back when it comes to our systematic practices for ensuring that we get the best bang for buck for the public money that we're spending. This is a major challenge because we know that we have big problems coming down the pike. We're going to have to work out how to solve those problems efficiently and ensure that we are getting the best value for the money that we are spending so we don't leave as many residual problems for the future generations. So that's kind of our intentions and sort of our sense of the problems. I just want to talk now about what our next steps are. And it's good to finally be able to talk about this on the back of the Infrastructure Action Plan that was released alongside this year's budget. That action plan asked Te Wahanga to work with Treasury to implement an infrastructure priority list, and it did say by 2026. What I will say to you is that you will hear from us well before 2026. And we are intending to work with the sector, both within and outside government, to shape this into something that will work to bring us towards that strategic vision for New Zealand as a whole. Happy to talk further about that. We could go on, but what I want to do at this point is invite our three panelists on to discuss this concept. If the panelists can start joining us on stage, I'll introduce them. I've asked our panelists to reflect on the value that they're seeking from an infrastructure priority list from the perspectives that they're coming in. So joining us now first, Sophie Dawson. Sophie's a partner in EY's infrastructure advisory practice, where her work focuses on commercial and financial advice to support transformations, transactions, and delivery of significant infrastructure projects. Of interest to me is an undergraduate in mathematics. She's got a master's degree in maths and a PhD in engineering and fluid dynamics, so I think that's kind of cool. Secondly, Peter Colacino, an internationally recognized leader in infrastructure policy, most recently leading policy development and reform for Infrastructure Australia, including the development of their market capacity tool and their infrastructure needs audit. So Peter will be giving a keynote discussion later on in the day, but he's agreed to come in and share his thoughts on this aspect of IA's work today, right now. And lastly but not least, Fraser Wiley, Managing Director of McConnell Dowell for New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. Fraser has over 30 years of experience in senior management roles across the sector and has moved into more governance roles over the last decade, where his roles include two of New Zealand's best performing alliance projects, the Memorial Park Alliance in Wellington and the alliance that delivered infrastructure for the 36th America's Cup in Auckland. Sophie, Peter, and Fraser, welcome and thank you. Sitting down. So look, just for our panelists, you've heard a bit about the Infrastructure Commission's view on this initiative and some of the problems that we're seeking to solve. I'd like to ask all three of you to just offer some reflections on where you're coming from and the challenges that you see in the infrastructure prioritization system in New Zealand at the moment, the problems you'd like to see solved. So maybe over to Sophie first.
I'll go first. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for inviting me on the panel. It's a pleasure to be here. We've heard a lot about the past couple of days about the infrastructure deficit, whether that's 100 billion, whether that's 200 billion. What we need to do is to plan where we're going to deliver to actually help bridge that gap. So as a country, we're going to need to consider what infrastructure will provide the best value and the best outcomes for our people and for our communities. We can't do everything. We've got limited resources. We need to consider where we're actually going to spend our money, where we're going to invest our time and our focus, and develop our resources and our capabilities and labour market. I think the prioritisation list is a really good opportunity to develop a consistent and transparent framework in order to do that. We also need to be thinking about planning for the future. We're thinking long term here, so 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. In 10 years' time, we're going to be, 6 million people? So we need to be thinking, long term and thinking for the future there. I think we've heard that we've got bipartisan support for the IPL with their Nationals announcement yesterday, so that's great. And we'll need to continue to have that long-term focus in order for it to be successful and look beyond that political cycle. So I see it as projects and programs that are nation building, that deliver the best value and the best outcomes. It's going to need to be quite flexible, incorporate and consider quite a great many things. So we need to look at cross-sector focus, we need to look across geographies, across islands, broader outcomes, and all those good equity, resilience and climate change things we'll have to consider. Also how it works for different stages of a project. So we're actually pushing projects forward and not holding them back. We tend to be quite risk-averse in New Zealand. We're very good at looking for reasons to say no or looking for reasons to delay decisions. I think we need to be quite bold and quite definite here and provide, as we've heard throughout this conference, more certainty, better pipeline that can benefit the whole market. I think that we need to get better at saying no and saying, giving constructive feedback to projects where we might say no rather than kicking the can down the road. When might be a good time to look at this again? Is it when we have 6 million people, or what previous analysis have we done in that project that could be used again, so we're not actually starting things from scratch again and again. How the prioritization list is approached and how it's rolled out, I think is going to be one of the most important things. I think it needs to be collaborative and not another barrier to actually delivering. So that tension between maintaining influence and being relevant whilst being objective and independent is going to be a really fine balance.
And Peter, I know that's something that IA's a tension that IA's been exploring for the last 15 years. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the experience over there?
Yeah, really happy to. So the first part to start for Infrastructure Australia is there have been 2 waves of priority list, if you like. The first wave was a report to COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, prior to 2013. And then the second wave was after the reconstitution of the organisation and the move to a formal list. The formal list, certainly a year or so ago, was around 200 projects, and it was cross-sectoral. It covered the 4 large economic infrastructure sectors: transport, water, telco and energy, as well as covering social infrastructure from green and blue assets through to hospitals. But in saying that, the vast majority of the projects were transport projects, and the vast majority were assessed using the ATAP guidelines. For those who are nerdy economists in the room, the ATAP guidelines is just a standard approach to assessing transport projects between Australia and New Zealand. So there had been this approach of building a list, a bottom-up list of submissions from states and territories. The list got quite long, and the consequence of that has been a question about whether it is affordable, which is a conversation that we just heard a moment ago, whether it's aligned to government priorities and delivering meaningful options and solutions, and also whether or not those solutions are right for the point in time or whether circumstances have changed. And probably something that's relevant and easy to touch for all of us is COVID's changed the way we've used transport. I mean, if you think about Sydney and Melbourne in an Australian context, public transport is at about 80% of pre-COVID levels. Road use is over 100%. So every transport project on the list, every business case assessed, and I have to say I've personally been through 54, and I've been through hundreds of initiatives, so pre-business case, strategic business cases. They're all now out of date, all of them. So everything on the list needs to be reassessed, and that's not occurred. So it's really important. Certainty needs to be pegged against the natural uncertainty of the environment we live in, and we need to make sure that the advice that we're providing as experts or through evidence is contemporary, it's meaningful, it's impactful, and we're making better decisions, not locking in terrible ones.
So that point on certainty, Fraser, it would be really interesting to hear your reflections on that, as that's one of the things that is so vital in the civil sector, yeah?
Yeah, I think there's a common theme, and we've seen this for years here, and I think everybody's just crying out for that certainty. Nobody can do resource planning or equipment allocations until we've got that certainty, and what we see is it being politicised quite a lot. Issues become affordability. Quite often projects come to market and then are pulled because they go over allocation funding, and then we have a mix-up again, and this continually happens, and it's so just really impacts any productivity you could get out of the sector. So I think there's a real key here to unlock that productivity. Is we have high-performing teams on one project, and we can't get continuity to go to the next job, and I think that's a real opportunity lost.
So productivity, I'm always fond of Paul Krugman's comment that in the long run, productivity is everything, right? Fraser, what are some cases where we've gotten it right, where actually we have managed to build productivity as we go through a sequence of projects?
I think it's interesting. We've done some small jobs. We've made an investment into a tunnelling machine, and it takes quite a long time. We've actually a tunnelling capability to actually upskill into direct pipe has taken us. We're now on our 5th project. The productivity curve we've seen on that has been exceptional. We've now won 2 international awards. When you've got that continuity of pipeline, you can really upskill your people. And it's interesting, the machines from Hera Connect, they see us as a exemplar in that field. And I think it's those sorts of things, and I think that should be happening all over. I think if we've got panels that can actually keep repeating, we can upskill, train people, invest in equipment, that's where the real opportunity. So I think, Melbourne's a good example with the level crossing removals, where they've got 4 alliances and they are awarded, they share all the IP, and I think they've seen a limb too. The margins on that come down to really affordable levels, and the level of productivity, using a lot of digital work there. I think that's an exemplar where turning over, doing about $9 billion worth of work per annum. So it's a huge program, and they're really smashing it out of the park.
Peter, could I just tease that out really quickly to say
I was going to ask a follow-up actually on how IA sort of dealt with that issue of programs. Yeah, so go for it.
That's exactly where I was going to go. So programmatic delivery is incredibly important, and finding opportunities in order to build certainty for both workforce upskilling and capability build it's incredibly important. It's a way to drive meaningful change in the sector. And we've seen it absolutely in Level Crossing Removal Authority, who've done a great job. But you've also seen it in organisations like Sydney Water and the Partnering for Success program. You've seen it in Queensland through the Bruce Highway enhancements, and across a number of these very large projects. And you fundamentally have the same opportunity here in New Zealand across a vast number of sectors. The focus in the UK now, just as a bit of a benchmark, is hospitals in the same sense. So programs very important, but they do require a different type of thinking, because there will be projects within a program that are very good, and there will be projects that are perhaps less good, but there's economies around doing them concurrently. So you need to think holistically about the long-term outcomes you're trying to deliver. And the second piece is a long list of projects can be important. In fact, it is important because it provides a level of certainty, but actually the really critical thing is moving from a 4-year forward estimates view of budget funding to a 10-year view of affordability envelopes. That is the thing that unlocks confidence in the sector to invest in building capability.
And that's something that interestingly, just if I can editorialize a bit, it's easier to do at the local government level, although it's, you've got, as we just heard, quite tight funding and financing constraints at that level, because they are asked to do 10-year long-term plans. Central government doesn't, interestingly, hold itself to the same discipline.
But perhaps should.
Oh, quite possibly. Well, I wanted to dig into that a little bit, right? Because that issue of sort of certainty over a longer time. Sophie, one of the questions I had for you, right? We've got a design decision about, what do we mean by a priority list? Is it a menu, right? You could order the lamb, you could order the seafood. They're both good. Or is it more of a ranked list? We think you should order the lamb, right? And what trade-offs? What are the benefits of different approaches that you would see?
I think that, a rank list is very difficult to justify, that you could spend a lot of time and effort hashing out, which project sits at number 1, number 2, and so far down the track. Is it Waitemata Harbour Crossing is more important than Dunedin Hospital, or do we actually need to, deliver them all? So I think that's quite a difficult one to grapple with. We've got an infrastructure deficit across many sectors. It's not just one, and we need to start thinking of infrastructure as a network rather than just like individual and isolated projects, because benefits of projects will multiply as you consider them on a more integrated basis. You think of housing development, you're also going to need roading, you're going to need utilities, you're going to need schooling, so they all kind of are related. And we're not going to deliver on things like net zero, on climate change, on resilience, if we're not thinking in that kind of integrated way and we're considering each project in isolation. I think the third thing is that it's really hard to appraise projects on a consistent basis between different sectors. You were talking about, the priority list in Australia. It was mainly focused on transport projects, and I think that's because there was a kind of precedent set of looking at, CBAs and what's the BCR of each project, and being able to quantify the benefits is one thing, but for social infrastructure, it can be quite difficult to quantify and value those benefits. It's very easy to build up the costs, but a bit harder on the benefit side. And it also depends on what you're comparing it to. So what's your baseline? What's your do nothing or do minimum case? And that can really change how you're looking. So I think BCRs are very useful when you're looking at relative options, but maybe not across different projects and what the priorities are. So in answer to your question, I think probably it's not either the lamb or the seafood. We're looking at a platter or a smorgasbord or something like that. Yeah.
With good wine pairings.
Yeah,
Ideally.
exactly.
Peter, this leads on to something that you and I have discussed over time, right? Which is the role of strategic vision in sort of in setting out what you need to do. And I touched on that in my introductory remarks. Can you dig into that a little bit? A sense of sort of where you're going as a country. What's the importance of that for an exercise like this?
Look, I think ultimately to start that conversation, you need to ask whether you want to stay in the status quo while the rest of the world evolves around you, or whether you want to move with, your contemporary peers, your partners, etc. And there are countries that have stood still. I mean, you had that period of isolation in Japan, which frankly didn't work out that well for them. You've had a period of isolation in the US, which didn't work that well for them either. And so there have been other benchmarks through a long period of time. None of the stories have happy endings. So frankly, it's not reasonable to just expect that incremental improvement, building in small ways on the status quo, will lead to future success. So if we've accepted that we need to move, before you set off on the journey, you need to decide which direction you're headed in, or you'll head off in the wrong direction. You might be walking backwards and in fact taking retrograde steps, making decisions that you've already ruled out and has been lost through, a loss of organisational knowledge. So fundamentally, this point of defining a vision where you want to get to is the starting point for every conversation at a country level. And New Zealand is already on that journey. You have the wellbeing budget, you have a number of parameters that have been set by the government to help to set some guideposts. But I would say perhaps you have too many. I've heard a number, sort of in the order of 200 measures. That's a big list. Hard to weigh off those priorities, particularly in a context of running CBA across your investment decisions. I would say if you want anything that looks good, delivers intergenerational change, impacts socio-economic issues, particularly around intergenerational poverty, then CBA is not the right tool to use as a sole tool for decision making. It is something to use, but it's not the sole tool. So this idea of defining a vision is critical, Peter. And the other point that's critical is to know that Australia didn't get it right. We don't have a vision nationally. There's no set of goals, not 200, not 10, not even one. And in IA's Act, there's a whole bunch of considerations that need to be included that aren't supported by government. There's a statement of expectation from ministers that actually doesn't have the support of government. And that's played out in what has become the review of Infrastructure Australia recently, and something I'll speak about later. So I'd just say this idea of understanding problems but not understanding outcomes, vision, is a real challenge. And also this idea of, a bottom-up explanation of the vision also is not right. It needs to be led. It needs to be led centrally at a whole-of-nation level, and then it needs to cascade through levels of government, cascade through organisations, and ultimately into project land.
So Fraser, I just wanted to dig into that. From your perspective, we can all think of cases where we don't have a shared vision or we might have trouble articulating one, but are there any areas where you think this might actually be quite easy for us to get our heads together and say, this is where we're headed together?
Look, I think there's a whole lot of things that are being discussed at the moment. 3 waters or 10 waters is a classic example of where we could actually get some strategic vision and start rolling that out. I think if you reflect back and see what happened with fibre and the rollout of fibre across New Zealand and how that served us through COVID is a pretty an exemplar of great courageous decision making and putting the country in a good spot. So I think we need to see more of that, more certainty. I think it needs to be, interesting listening to the last panel, there needs to be regional allocation, and so the priorities from the regions are actually put up for themselves as well. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity here, but there just has to be that vision and backed up with a commitment, because I think that we're all fatigued by things coming and going and not being able to allocate resource and people and train. And I think we're competing globally too, and I think with Australia making residency a lot easier, I think that's really tangible to everybody in the room now that we are at risk of losing highly skilled people across to Australia.
I might just pivot a little bit. There's an interesting question from the audience that I think kind of comes onto this, which is around community expectations on is there an issue with raising people's expectations around proposed projects before there's a funding commitment? So does talking about stuff make it harder? Maybe Sophie, I'd be interested in your perspectives on that question.
I think we do tend to jump to solutions quite quickly without necessarily exploring what are the problems we're actually trying to solve. I think that's something that actually was done a little bit better in Australia, has been starting to be done better in Australia, Peter. But really getting to the bottom of what are those problems and what issues are we trying to overcome and what outcomes are we trying to gain from that, and understanding that will help us then look at the solutions and look at the range of options. And there might be some non-capital intensive options that we might be able to utilise that will help us fit within budget envelopes and things like that. And so I think that's something that would be good to instill that kind of rigour into the prioritisation list framework without, again, making sure that it's not yet another hoop that you have to jump through and creating another barrier.
So, if maybe what I kind of hear there is there needs to be a point of entry for a problem where you can say, yep, we actually all do agree this is a problem. Somebody should start looking at the solution. Peter...
And just to add to that, we need to evidence that problem. We need to actually have some underlying data to understand the problem and how the problem might change in the future, and what happens if you don't provide a solution for that problem. How will it bear out?
Peter, that's something that the Infrastructure Australia's approach has done quite well, is actually capture stuff at that early stage and say, yep, we agree this is a problem, there's evidence for it, not yet at the solution stage, but keep this on your radar. Has that been effective in your view?
That has been an approach both for the infrastructure priority list and the Australian infrastructure audit, which is our needs assessment. And there's a policy cycle that's at play in Australia. It's definitely an improvement on where it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. However, it's not quite perfect. And the observation I'd make is it's very confusing to the public, the fine line difference between a problem explanation and a solution. And very often, because of the nature of the Australian framework, i.e. putting forward a project for funding, a solution will come before a problem. So making sure there is that rigour around holistically, and I would argue nationally, looking in a top-down way to understand sizing, so monetising, or in some other way quantifying a gap from the existing state and where you would like to be is really very important. And it opens a really interesting conversation about minimum service levels. So we do have, for instance, in New South Wales, a requirement that I think the number's 70% of houses will be within 200 metres of a bus stop. It's a great number, but if you live in a town with no buses, it's completely irrelevant. So we've got these minimum service levels that don't really relate to reality. and to service expectations. So this process of normalising minimum service levels in both an urban and a regional setting, and a politician being brave enough to say you have to expect something different if you choose to live in a regional area or an isolated area, is where it starts to get really, really challenging to effectively define problems.
I'll give a little bit of a plug for some work that my colleague Judy Kavanagh is leading on what's fair in providing and paying for infrastructure, because I think this is a fairness question, right? What are the service levels that people can expect, and what should they expect to pay for them? But that's a tangent, but I always love promoting Judy's work. Just on another audience question, this was a really interesting one. I think it's quite important for actually getting this to work well. Fraser and Sophie have both touched on this issue of duplication or sort of added steps. And the question from the audience is, how do you respond to the challenge that an IPL would duplicate the business case process and add time, cost, and bureaucracy? That's kind of a question for us as we design the thing, so I might actually just sort of reshape it a little bit and ask Fraser and Sophie, what do you want to see in this area in terms of streamlining and integration? Maybe Fraser first.
I think it's just got to be really clear and simple. I mean, that was interesting hearing from the last panel about this allocation, but nobody knows how to access it, and they're not sure how it's going to be evaluated. And I think we're all in that same, whenever we're putting in a proposition, we really want to understand, what the key drivers for the decision making are, how that's going to get evaluated. And I think that's just, we overcomplicate things, and procurement sometimes gets elongated beyond all proportion, and it doesn't always turn up with what outcome you're looking for.
I mean, there's this issue of churn, right, which Sophie touched upon, right? People redoing and redoing business cases and getting the same result. How do we solve that problem, Sophie?
I think that, there's plenty of examples of that where you look at a project for 20 years, we talk about it, for Transmission Gully, for example, I think did the geotech several times on that, and...
Were the rocks the same every time?
Yeah. Well, who knows? Maybe they've moved around with in New Zealand, who knows? But really being, I think it's about being brave. And making sure that when you do make a decision, you actually make a decision, you don't just kick it down the road. And I think I touched on it before, that you are, when you say no, you actually are constructive in that feedback. You actually do make a decision and say no for these reasons, or when it might be good to look at it again. But I think the really important thing for this IPL is to have a collaborative process, like how it works and how you make it meaningful and relevant is going to be key, because you don't want to have, say, a black box that you just submit your project or program to, and it goes away and gets assessed and appraised for a few months, and then you come back and say, oh, you needed to have looked at this or thought about this. It needs to be an iterative process where you can influence the project while still being objective. So no pressure, Peter. But it's going to be quite a fine balance of how it's rolled out.
Oh, look, I mean, what I'll say there is that this is really reinforcing a lot of the discussions we've been having around government and internally, right? That we can't expect other people to be transparent and clear if we aren't transparent and clear about what we expect to see and how we expect to assess. I think Peter had a really good point on that. We need to be collaborative. We need to integrate. This is about drawing out the best of existing processes rather than replacing them all. I think that's been a key message and key consideration for us the way through.
I think quite often you do a re-evaluate a business case if you don't like the answer the first time, and I think that's again stupidity, isn't it? Really, I think we really got to go. Okay, we want to do this project or not? We want to go forward or not? And I think that's that strategic vision. So yes, it can give you relativity, but if you're too wedded to that process, you won't get the outcomes you're looking for. Well, need some courageous leadership at times, and I think we lack that in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think of port studies, right? I remember sort of discussing the most recent one with our chair, Alan Bollard, and I said, I worked on a port study back in 2012, and Alan looked at me and said, you know, he's been around for ages. He said, oh, yes, I did mine in the 80s, right. The issue's never going to go away, and it's always going to be reinvestigated, and there's a cost to that. Here's another question from the audience that I might shoot over to Peter, because I think you have some really interesting reflections on this from the IA, which is what level of projects would this apply to? Is this mega projects only, or could this be used to small projects as well, or packages of small projects?
Fabulous question. My starting point in that observation is to say, did you know generally that large projects have terrible BCRs? I challenge you to show me the big transformative project with a good-looking BCR, but I can show you thousands of roundabouts and curb and guttering enhancements with absolutely fantastic BCRs, strong economic multipliers. So if the question you're asking is, how can we drive economic change, then invest in a bunch of small projects. They look fabulous, and frankly, you can engage local industry and you can build capacity and capability, and then over time, you've got a sector that's growing and could participate more in transformative projects, and who knows, one day they might be operating TBMs. But you will live in this world of incrementalism where I started as saying is actually not the way to drive lasting transformative change, and digital connectivity is actually a really fantastic example of that. I mean, my argument would be you live in a world where you want to see greater use of data, better access to information, and there are only a few ways to achieve that. It could be fixed line mobile, but you know, generally it's about telco these days. It's not about the Pony Express and a newspaper. It's actually about investing in digital infrastructure. So if you make that call, then you do need to start to think in a much bigger way. You need to think, about larger projects. And it's been a stumbling point for IA. So IA undertook some work to understand what could be deemed nationally significant economic impact. It was measured in the tens of billions of dollars each year. There was an MPV measure on top of that. And ultimately, it led to a few roundabouts sneaking through. So if you want, as a country, to drive transformative change, choose the areas you want to drive that change, and get an organisation to look not only at the projects, but to the reforms as well that can drive that change. And, you know, I'm going to give a really great closing conference presentation on the power of good policy. I mean, if you're not a bit snoozy now after last night's drinks, you will be by the end of this. But actually, you impact the largest number of people in the most cost-effective ways through policy reform. So don't forget the non-built alongside the built solutions, pricing, regulation, all these really wonderful things. But start to think about how to drive meaningful change in the country in the areas that you want to do it.
So speaking of meaningful change, I understand, this is a bit of a cheeky question, so feel free to kick it to touch. I understand there were some questions for a minister yesterday. 2026, 3 years to do this. Why is it taking so long? I'd be interested to get all your thoughts on, is it better to go faster or more deliberately? And how should we roll this thing out anyway? Maybe Sophie, to put you on the spot.
I think, you know, we've heard throughout this conference, we need to get on and start delivering. So I think the IPL needs to be well thought through. It's not going to be meaningful or influential if it's not transparent, if it doesn't consider all the kind of national priorities, and if projects that end up being on the list actually don't get funded. You know, it has to have some kind of teeth to it. And how you strike that balance is going to be all in how it is set up and rolled out. And I think, you know, we've got an example there from Australia where they've had actually 2 bites of that to make sure that that it is doing what it needs to do. At the same time, that shouldn't stop projects from happening in the meantime. So we shouldn't be waiting for the prioritisation list and then start the projects. You know, we know that we've got to get on with stuff in the meantime. So I think it can be happening in parallel.
Mm-hmm. So that's a vote for deliberate, or maybe deliberate and fast.
I'm going to give 2 answers. The first one you'll hate, the second one you'll love, Pete, which is, I don't know why you can't do it in 2 years, a year for the assessment framework and a year for the list. But I do know why. It's because government agencies, particularly working in this long-term thinking and policy space, are globally poorly funded. So actually, if you invest in building strong, capable organisations, resourced by the right number of people, yeah, of course you can do things more quickly. And you should look at the great work that others have done. I'm going to show you in a minute a whole bunch of agencies around the world that do similar pieces of work. And in fact, the ATAP guidelines and the work of Treasury here in New Zealand are all great things to leverage. And then the final piece is, you shouldn't just replicate work that's already occurring, i.e. within country. You should actually think about why Te Wahenga's been asked to do the work and what is the unique value add. And I'd say if there's one agency in this country that should be the custodian of the nation's infrastructure data, it's your agency, and that should be the foundation for a priority list.
I'm a big advocate for going fast. I think, and you can do that in a lot of ways, but you've got to bring everybody with you. I think, we've got a lot of good examples where collaboration has seen some really great outcomes, and I think you've got to be really get everybody with a sole purpose of what the outcome looks like and get everybody on board, and then pace. I think we're fatigued with slow.
Well, there you have it. That's some interesting reflections on the need for speed and the importance of being deliberate and collaborative in the process. So we've got 11 seconds left, so I will only say thank you to our panelists and thank you to everyone in the room for the great questions. And please do get in touch. We are seeking to engage with you in coming months. Thanks very much. Yeah.